Okay. Welcome to the next iteration of our series, Stories Behind the CV, formerly called Growing Up in Science. This is a series in which we are joined by professors who will talk about their trajectories to where they are outside of a more traditional research context. We are very lucky to have with us Dawn Mechanic-Hamilton today, who is an assistant professor of neurology and is also director of the Cognitive Fitness Program and Neuropsychological Services at the Penn Memory Center. I will leave further introduction to her, but thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. So I'm at the Penn Memory Center, and I'll just say a very little bit about that before we kind of go backwards in time. But I'm a neuropsychologist there, which means I'm trained as a clinical psychologist through a PhD program, and then within that program specialized in brain behavior relationships and in neuropsychology, and then went on to do my internship postdoc specifically in neuropsychology. And so right now I do part of my time is spent in the clinic with patients with neurodegenerative disease, and the other half of the time is spent doing research. And in both of those arenas, I'm lucky enough to have students from all different levels of training who are part of the clinical work and the lab. And so it's really an exciting kind of combination of different pieces of academia and clinical work that have come together. But it took a while to get there. So I think that was the vision I had in mind. Once I knew what a neuropsychologist was, once I knew that you could get a PhD and do this, once I knew all these different pieces that I really had no idea about kind of early on in life. So I guess I'll start back before I knew these things and even knew kind of what to think about in terms of goals and ideas of visions of how I would see myself working and being in these different roles. Mm-hmm. So I know I've heard other people start way back, kind of really early on. I grew up on Long Island. And I went to my local school, my local high school. I came from a family of teachers, and there was an assumption that in the family that I would go to college. But when my mom went to college, she had two choices, and she could be a teacher or secretary, and then she had choices of kind of two places she could do that, and so. When it came time to kind of think about that, in high school I was very involved in kind of the leadership and a little bit in sports and things like that. Mm-hmm. I really liked being parts of teams, so I was part of a bunch of different types of groups and teams, and I was really looking for the next step. And my guidance counselor happened to be someone who was really looking very specifically at each student, which I think was really lucky, that she was really trying to find good matches for her students. And she told me to look at Wellesley College, which I didn't know about when I was applying to schools, and I had never thought I would go to an all-women's college. Mm-hmm. But that sort of planted the seed that might be a good match for me. I wanted a small college. And all along the way, so I didn't know anything about this like neuropsychology stuff yet. I thought that what I would end up doing would be to become a doctor, because what I kind of knew about myself is that I liked science, and I liked asking questions and doing tests and figuring out the answers. And my doctor was the only person that I saw do that. I feared him. He was scary because he gave me shots and throat cultures, which I proceeded to bite in half when he gave them to me, which my mom won't let me forget about. But he was the only person that I knew that did that kind of work. You know, him and my physics professor in high school, or physics teacher, I guess, in high school. And, you know, that was sort of my model. I thought, well, I guess I'll be a pediatrician because that's where you ask questions and you do tests and you figure out the answer. But I didn't particularly like the sort of blood aspect of medical school, of having to, you know, sort of lay hands on, you know, and fixed physically. And so that seemed to be a problem, you know, as I was like kind of thinking through that. But I eventually did end up at Wellesley, and I still had that in mind, so I took all these pre-med classes as I was taking other classes. And I think there were like a couple of people along the way that sort of stood out to me that either asked me the question of kind of like, what do you want to do? Or, you know, where do you see yourself going? Or I just looked at them and said, oh, what you do is really cool. It's really interesting. How do I get there? And so the first person that showed me something that like I got super excited about was in a brain and behavior class in school. And it was Professor Joanne Berger-Sweeney, who's no longer at Wellesley, but had this great class, and she showed us this clip of the frozen addicts, which is this series of cases of individuals who ended up taking street drugs that had a drug in it that basically brought on Parkinsonism. And that led to being able to have a model for Parkinson's disease. But just that clip was so fascinating. I had never seen anything like that. I hadn't seen sort of what those kinds of brain changes can do to both cognition and behavior. And so seeing that was really exciting. It was, I think, the first time I got really excited about, you know, an area of work. And so then I became a psychobiology major. That's what they called it at the time. I'm sure it's called something different now. But I still figured like I must need to go to medical school to get there, because that still seems the way this happens, you know, that people go to medical school. And so as I kept on going along in school, I was still taking all of these, you know, I took organic chemistry and all these things that you needed to take for medical school. And then eventually got to a class with, and this was sort of the second person that sort of showed me some path, to a professor's class who was working essentially as a neuropsychologist, at least in her research work. And she kind of brought up this idea that this field existed, which I had not heard of before. I still didn't know what you did to get into that field, but at least there was a name for it at this point, which was exciting to finally sort of have something to label it, because those, you know, goals without words, it's really hard to form those. And so I started to look around more, and that kind of brought me to a flyer that I saw hung up in one of the labs for a job in Boston. So I was right outside of Boston, and it was a job in a lab in Boston. And that kind of took me, still thinking that I was going to apply to medical school, but into a lab that was doing lots of work in movement disorders and non-invasive brain stimulation and all kinds of other things. And that's where I started to sort of find more of my way, but also realize that I was not on the timeline that everyone else was on. So, you know, most of the people who were going to medical school or going to graduate school at that time had kind of figured it out and they were applying and they were like ready to roll when we were coming out of college, and I was like, I'm just starting to discover what it is I want to do, which felt a little scary. Like everyone seems to have this path. I think that was the first time I saw my timeline change from those around me, and that was something that I think kept on happening over time as I've gone through like different stages, especially in grad school, and then also sort of as a junior faculty. And I think that was sort of the beginning of like trying to grapple with not being on that same trajectory and timeline as other people, and figuring out like, is that okay, and how do I manage that? And so I ended up taking 4 years off, where I worked in different labs, and each year I would add another lab to my work, which I don't suggest people do, because you just like add another boss each year, and the other ones don't take away a lot of the work, so you end up doing a fair amount of work over time. But it was really exciting because there was a neuropsychologist there, and she was kind of the next person who I was like, oh, I see you're doing that thing that I want to do, and tell me how you do that. Like, how do you get to where you are? And so she was extremely generous with her time, and was able to sit down with me and tell me kind of what all of the paths were that you could take to get there, and the types of schools you would be applying to and where they were. And I think that was the first time I realized like how necessary a mentor is. And it was like my first real mentorship experience, or mentee experience. And I started to figure out kind of what the questions were even to ask, because I didn't really know what those were. But she was, so generous and understanding that she sort of gave me the questions, which was really nice, and kind of her to help me kind of along that path. And so that's when I sort of flipped and decided, oh, I can go to grad school, and I don't have to go through medical school to try to, really eventually get into a very niche area of medicine where I do brain behavior work. What I want to do is actually kind of different than that. And so psychology seemed like the right route, and neuropsychology seemed like the perfect route for the things that I wanted to do. And I have to say, at that point, I was really naive about like getting into schools and how difficult that might be. And I got really lucky because I looked at all the schools and saw which ones had neuropsych tracks, and there weren't a lot of them at that time. And I said, oh, well, Drexel has a track, and the person I was with at the time, who's now my husband, was looking at residencies, and he was like, well, I really like Penn. And we're like, well, they're in the same city. That seems to work really well. Not really realizing that it's not quite that simple, and we just happened to get really lucky, and he ended up here for residency, and I ended up here for grad school. And so at that point, I felt like, I was like back on track. Like I was in grad school, I knew what I wanted to do. It felt like it was a really good match. And so, I kind of went along the way, figuring out all the things you do in grad school, how to be a student and a lab mate and a researcher and a clinician and all these things at the same time. And that was going along pretty smoothly until another sort of timeline sort of ripple came in, which was my first child. And so that was a wonderful event, but it was also an event that really sort of changed what I saw as sort of being the next steps. Mm-hmm. And that was in part because I was immediately put on bed rest halfway through my pregnancy. So So I went from being in a lab and seeing patients and taking classes to being in bed 24 hours a day for 4 months, which was, not something you plan for. And that apparently is the state of treatment in that situation. You just lie down for 4 months. So that's what I did. And that's where sort of like other mentors really started to play a role, because I really needed a lot of help. I mean, I couldn't do, the work that I was doing. And I think those mentors came from not just my supervisors on my clinical rotations and my supervisor and my mentor for my research, but also my co-students, so my peer mentors. And they really helped a tremendous amount. And I think that was like the first time I really thought about how, these were all our cohort, all of these people that I was working with, they were going to be my future colleagues. And everyone had all these different strengths, and we could learn so much from each other. And that was a time when they really stepped up in like a really beautiful way and helped me do things like take classes when I couldn't leave the house, and bring tapes. At that time, we didn't have, it was a while ago, so, it was 2006. So we didn't have FaceTime or iPhones that, we could just see class.
Did the school not let you take time off from class, or were you opting to?
So I
just
wanted to
continue?
stay, yeah, so that was one of the big questions, was what should I do at this point? Because I was in classes. And I talked to my advisor, and he said something that I think was so incredibly helpful at that time, and he was just like, life continues. Like, life happens when you're a grad student, and we can help you continue to be a part of your life and also be a grad student. And so
It's a good
it
lesson
was
for everybody.
Yeah, it was really, helpful just to hear those words, that he understood that, this was something that no one does purposefully. And it was part of everyone's journey to have a time when they might have this like ripple and timeline kind of blip. And so they allowed me to take classes while I was at home. So I would be on the phone for one of my classes. And then for the other class, the students would bring me little micro cassettes of the classes. And I did all my work and I handed it in. And that was, I could participate via phone and other ways. I couldn't do my clinical work, so that had to wait. That was but the other parts of it, they allowed me to sort of keep it moving. And so I think that was, that sort of timeline ripple and the idea of kind of pulling mentorship and partnership and help from all different places was really a good lesson in that moment, which was kind of a tough one. And that sort of extended my grad school time by 2 to 3 years, because after that I was sort of balancing having a son, because he was eventually born and he was there, and we had to take care of him, and so that's part of the deal, and so.
It's not over.
It's not over, no.
after
Those
that.
4 months in bed were just the beginning.
Probably looking forward to having that amount of rest.
Yeah, right, yeah. Yeah, I was amazed during those 4 months. So many things changed in Philadelphia. I would go out to a doctor's appointment once a month. There'd be new buildings. I think a new $10 bill or something came out at that time, and I was really freaked out by that. There was a lot going on. But it did, then there were a lot of questions. I think this is something that, parents and people who are caring for families, caring for parents, caring for young ones, other family members really struggle with is, how much can you do of of both of those jobs? And so I was able to have a fair amount of flexibility over the next couple of years, and that allowed me to, I did things like take in another child who I would watch part-time, and then the other half of my time I would go to the lab and I would do my dissertation work. But that allowed me to kind of do that and afford that because I could pay for childcare on the days that I went into the lab. And so, that was, lessons in certainly multitasking and trying to kind of balance those things. But I think that the thing that sort of stuck with me is that it's always sort of more than you expect. And so feeling like you're not really doing 100% at anything is I think very common. And I think that was a feeling that I had throughout that, certainly that period. And I think that's a feeling that sort of continues, to not be able to sort of be 100% at anything, and sort of making peace with that makes sense because you're actually doing multiple jobs. So you can't be doing multiple jobs all the time at 100%. So that was a good sort of learning time to figure out sort of what were the things that I wanted to be spending time on, and really trying to make really good use of the time I had when I was working, so that I could not work in other at other times. And then that parenting really kind of brought on lots of challenges as I went through all the next stages, because the next stages in a clinical psych program is you have to go to internship. And one of the things that's causes people to not get an internship is to geographically restrict yourself, which, as you can imagine, with the child, it was a little hard to kind of cast my net widely over the whole country. But I had someone, tell me from the very beginning, cast it as wide as you can. Now, you can always say no. You can always not put something on your list, But this way, at least you see what's out there and you feel like you've made like a really informed decision. And I think that was really helpful. And we, kind of picked a few places. Our negotiation was that I would only leave and live somewhere else if it was for a program that I thought was worth it. And I wouldn't do that for a program that wasn't like a top choice. And there were only 2 programs where that was feasible and it was worth it. That was because they were both near family. One on Long Island near my parents and one in Rhode Island near my sister. And so I ended up getting into the one in Rhode Island at Brown, and that was very exciting and also incredibly scary, because then I had to take there wasn't really a question, I was always taking my son with me, but my husband had to stay here because he has a position here at Penn, and so my sister and her family opened up their house to us, which was really the only way it was feasible, which was, again, another incredibly generous and kind gesture that made it possible. And to this day, there are, you never feel like you can pay someone back for saying like, oh, come and live in my house for a year, no problem, and with your child, no problem. And they have children too, and so one of the things that has come out of that is that the children are really close, and we have great relationships that came out of that. But there again, there was a peer that I have, a colleague, who had done almost the same thing the year before, and she for me was really, someone I could go to and say like, I see you're doing this. Is this really possible? Can I do this? How does this work? And so finding that mentorship and that sort of like feedback from people at all different levels of training, at the same level, and those who are, doing things in different orders was, again, really helpful. Because I think I had, always heard, look to your professors and find your professors, and that's incredibly helpful. And to this day, I have a whole kind of team of mentors who are professors in different areas. But the peer mentorship and those relationships, I think, were incredibly helpful along the way, too. And that was one of the times where I really kind of leaned on that to help me figure out if it was possible. So that got me through internship, and then I actually came back to Penn for postdoc. And that was one of those decisions where if I could have stayed, if it would have been feasible for my husband to join me there, that would have been my preference. But this was another one of those weighing of, I wasn't willing to live apart for another 2 years. And so the position, I was looking at positions in Philly, and luckily there were some great positions, and those worked out well. And so I started to get closer to like that final position that I was looking for, the one that Margaret O'Connor, who is the neuropsychologist who I spoke about in the very beginning, was sort of the model for. And how are we doing on time?
That's good.
Keep going?
Carry on.
Okay.
What?
Okay.
Yeah.
What next? Postdoc. So a little bit, yeah. So I had a second child. So that's another ripple. And a joy, absolutely. I just have to say that, And so in postdoc, I had my second child. And, I think that having my first child in grad school, because of the flexibility of it, of my particular program and the way my research was working out, it actually worked pretty well. Like I could stay home part of the time, and that wasn't really the case in postdoc because you kind of had to get it done. Like you've got these 2 years, and you've made this commitment with your mentor and supervisor, and there isn't really a way to take off more than whatever they give you, and you kind of have to get back. And that was, I think, the piece that was pretty hard, coming back. She was 10 weeks old, and that was soon for me. For other people, maybe not, but it felt very soon. But I did have a supervisor who, again, was very generous and allowed me to work from home 1 day a week, which really, I think, made the difference between me being able to do it and not, really sort of being at a breaking point of this is just too much for me to handle sort of physically and emotionally and cognitively. Like I just can't do it with sort of all of the things that you have to manage on a day-to-day basis. So that was something that allowed me to sort of get through those 2 years and actually finish my postdoc on time, which was great. And what I realized at that point was that working at the rate that I was working felt unsustainable at that point. And so what I decided was I wanted to try to negotiate a reduced effort time for 80% time, which I did for 1 year. And that was helpful in that when you're being paid for 80% time, you feel like you can leave, 1 day maybe, or half a day, but you're truly, in many positions, you're still doing more time than that. So I did it for a year, and I think it was really helpful as kind of a bridge to kind of get through that time, and then went back up to full-time, because that seemed to be, at that point, I was putting in 100% of my time, and so I kind of wanted to have that commensurate with pay. Yeah. So that was the start of sort of a longer than expected kind of period in kind of junior facultyhood, sort of that beginning stage when you're trying to get up and running. And something we talked about before we even started was that, the titles that I have right now are around my clinical work, right? So I cover neuropsychological services in our center and a clinical program, but I don't, at this stage, being here for the years I've been here, there are many other people who would have a lab established already. But the trajectory of my time and sort of the ripples in time from that point on when I went full-time, everything seemed to take longer. And I think, a part of that is, that a lot of positions are designed for sort of like full steam ahead, 150%, you're an academic and you're a clinician, and someone else is taking care of everything else in your life. And that's just not the reality for a lot of people who are doing these jobs now. I think men and women. And so that I think, along with some other sort of blips along the way, I changed from one department to another. And so you sort of start over in some ways when you do that. Those things, I think, kind of made that junior period last a lot longer than maybe if I didn't have those other responsibilities. And so the thing that I think has made a difference more recently in feeling like I'm getting on track is really trying to find mentorship for all of these different areas that you tend to function in as a faculty member. From, figuring out how to write grants sort of early on before I was writing many, many, many and only getting a few, but you have to write like 10 of them to get 2. From that to, figuring out how to sort of negotiate being in a department and your position in a department. And in my department, I'm the only neuropsychologist who's on my track. And so no one else has done that. And so we're trying to figure that out kind of together, like what that looks like. So that's been sort of a learning process. And when you have a different degree in a medical department, you don't have an MD, figuring out your role and really sort of letting other people know kind of what your role could be and how you might work within that department is an area that can be exciting and fun because it's like a way to work, interdisciplinarily and really learn about different approaches to kind of the same problems, but it's also, of course, challenging along the way. Yeah.
Thank you. I think this might be a good time to transition over to questions from the audience.
Sure. Yeah.
I really appreciated what you were saying about peer mentorship also being an important type of mentorship, and I feel like I've experienced it but never quite labeled it like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm kind of wondering, in your experience, has it been most effective when it's kind of come up organically, or when you try and like facilitate kind of that kind of relationship explicitly?
I think I've had it happen both ways. So I personally have sought out people who are sort of like one step ahead, to see sort of, okay, I think I understand where I am now, but how do I like jump to the next spot? So in that way, I think I've experienced it. That was like more pointed in that I, kind of found someone and sought them out. I think in my cohort, it was a lot more organic because we were just friends, and so we, sort of came to each other with questions and help. I think with the students that come through clinically through and in research through our lab and our clinic, I do try to connect people with each other who are at different stages, because I kind of see the value in it and see how helpful that can be, and how confusing it can be, particularly if you're the first person in your family to do any of these things and you don't have someone else to go to, or if you're trying to do something that's a little bit different, and not many people have that information, or the professors that you would normally go to, maybe things have changed in the system and how you kind of work through it in the interim. And I know I've seen that for myself in the time since I graduated. There are differences in the way in which people prepare themselves to get into these grad programs, the same ones that the same one I went to. And so going back to the people who are closer to that process, I think can be really helpful, both organically and trying to kind of find those people and connect with them, or asking someone who sort of knows people at all the different stages to connect you with them so that you can do that.
I noticed that you mentioned many points of like gratitude for those around you, and kind of acknowledged the flexibility of people in your program when you were a student, and so on. I guess my question is, how have you like found a balance between like self-advocacy and professionalism, and also like being able to ask for help where help is needed, and like how do you navigate that?
Yeah, I think there were times when I felt like I had no choice but to ask for help. It was, sort of you're flat on your back and your doctor tells you can't get up for 4 months. And so in those situations, I think I felt defeated in that moment. And it took a while to sort of build back up from that. So, I think in that case, it was more out of desperation. And I think since then, I've really been looking to try to be more introspective about, when I do need help, and being okay with not knowing a whole bunch of stuff. Like if you're working in any area of research, you probably know a piece of that really well, but there are so many pieces that you probably intersect with that there's no reason why you should be an expert in those areas. And so, or there's, and kudos to the other person who is. And so, I think I've tried to take a step back in those times when I felt like I needed help. I didn't particularly want to ask for it because it felt like, well, why shouldn't I do this just myself? But then I think about their expertise and think like, well, this is what they're great at. And so, if it's someone who's willing to help, maybe I can offer them something in return, and so figuring out kind of what you can offer and then what you might be able to learn from their expertise, I think is helpful.
In terms of on the job search, so
Yeah.
at that point, how did you bring up, or when, if or when,
Yeah.
would one bring up like family obligations and you letting the department know that these are the things that you're passionate about and would need more time, and especially it feels like at a research-intensive university such as Penn, where sort of we don't see behind this CV, and it seems like academics are very much focused on their professionalism. In your experience when you went on a job search, how much did that play a role in your interviews, and sort of how did you frame that work that you did?
So it was a little bit, it wasn't quite the same situation as someone who was going out to other institutions, because I stayed here, because I was here for postdoc. So everyone kind of knew my situation. I got my first job here out of postdoc because the person who I was working with and was connected to the Penn Memory Center, they wanted to build this clinical program. And so I was kind of brought on to do that. And I knew at that point that I was interested in research, but I also knew that at that moment, I could not mount the fight I needed to mount if I was gonna try to get a research-intensive job in that moment. And I really needed a bridge if I was gonna kind of circle back around and be able to do more research and have and write lots of grants to eventually get some grants. And so for me, I didn't have to have that conversation, from, starting off from knowing no information, because most people kind of knew where I was at and I had worked with them already. And so when I was negotiating the 80% position, I was very upfront about that. The reason why I'm doing this is because I think I can put in 80% time and fully put in that time, but I think I'll fall short if I try to do 100% right now, with the idea being, and this was also stated explicitly, I want to build back up to that, but I need a year. This was a time when I would literally walk home every day and count whether or not I felt like I could keep doing this job. And so I kept track, I like data, so I kept track every day of whether or not I felt like I could keep doing this. And if more days than not, I felt like I could keep doing this, then that sort of gave me the answer. So, I think it is tricky to know how and when to bring that up. I think knowing people in the field in different institutions and being able to, sort of get a feel for what positions are like for people who might be in a similar situation as you are going into it, is kind of a sort of another route of getting that information without having to lead with it. Because we want to walk into positions that we're set up for success in, and knowing how they work and what you're able to do in them is really important.
Do you think you would have had a different negotiation strategy if you had sort of gone somewhere else where they didn't really know kind of your story?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think I think it would have been a different, the jobs would have looked very different because it was such a niche thing that I was trying to do here, that they happened to want someone to do it, and I was really interested, and I had been working on it during postdoc, so it was a good fit. But yeah, going out onto the market, if I had done that in that moment, I'm not sure if I would have. I actually think I probably would have taken a position as sort of a and been in a holding pattern for a year or two. I think I probably would have needed that before I felt like I could sort of launch into a position that I would see as more of like a long-term one that I would get into and really kind of push ahead in it. I think that's likely what I would have done. It's hard to know in retrospect, but I think I would have. Yeah.
So what are the institutional things that would make some of this easier?
Oh, that's a good question. So I think the timelines, the more I think about the clocks that you have for tenure and the clocks that you have for, like here, you have a clock for CE and you have a clock for tenure track. And, I'm on my clock now for CE. I feel like I'm in a better place to be on that clock than I was certainly 6-7 years ago. I think if I had started on it then, I'm not sure if I would feel comfortable being there, and I think I would be very concerned about my ability to stay. I think those clocks put people at a disadvantage who have, life going on in the background, and a lot of life that, requires your attention. They do give an extra year here for having a child. That is if you have a child once you're on the clock. So I had my children before my clock started, so you don't get that time. So I think timelines are, they're tough because, you certainly want something that pushes people to work hard and to get things done, and to not sort of languish. But they really put you at a disadvantage if you've got those other things going on.
Out of curiosity,
Yeah.
when you say they put another year on the clock if you have a child, is that
Yeah.
only if you're physically giving birth to that child?
No, if you adopt, I
Okay.
believe.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool, fantastic.
Yeah,
And that could
yeah.
serve for a couple of parents as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Sorry, I was just
Yeah.
asking because sometimes institutions do not have parity in these.
Yeah, so my
in these
husband
respects.
got
Mhm,
the
fantastic.
time for the
Excellent.
kids.
Excellent.
Yeah.
But
But
I
I
don't
didn't.
understand how much effort goes into putting together summer camp schedules.
Oh my gosh, I haven't done that this year. Yes, I
Oh my
know.
gosh.
Yeah, yeah,
Way harder than diapers.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, it takes a lot of your headspace. When you're just planning other people's, whether it's, yeah, and yeah, exactly, survival. And we're in a position now where we're like the sandwich generation, so we're planning for, in some cases for our parents and for kids. It's a lot of headspace. Yeah, and there's a finite amount. We're not good at multitasking. We know that.
More questions?
The question I have then, now that you're in your current position,
Yeah.
is this the position that you dreamt of? And if it is or it is not,
Yeah.
where do you see yourself in the future?
It is. I mean, it is, and I considered leaving it recently and did not want to, and literally said those words in my meeting with my mentorship team. This is my dream job. I don't want to leave it. And so, yeah, it's, there are challenges, even you learn about the challenges in your dream job, but I'm doing all the things that I really wanted to be doing, which is really exciting.
More questions? I would particularly invite those who haven't asked a question yet. Have be things that are on your mind.
Do you have any advice for people in kind of carving out their niche in their career path if it's a little bit different for whatever reason, time
I think something that I found helpful along the way, and I think I probably still struggle with it, is just accepting that it might be different and that that's okay, and not trying to make those comparisons, because they sort of take up so much of your time that is sort of better spent elsewhere. Yeah, I mean, I think that timelines, I think they're made with very restricted ideas about who's doing them and how to do it, and so they shouldn't apply to everyone. Like, it just doesn't make sense that everyone can do these vastly different jobs in exactly the same time. And so, taking time in between jobs, trying something different out, those, I think each time I did that, there was something that I learned from it, and that was really helpful. And so, sort of finding a way to recognize that there is a lesson, or there's something good that you get out of like those kind of sharp turns that you didn't realize were coming, and yeah, being kind to yourself about having to take them at times.
What's your favorite part of your work right now?
It's the research team. My research is sort of just getting really going, and being able to work with people from different backgrounds. Like, we're working with developers and a nurse and students at all different sort of levels. I said I like teams, and I liked being a part of a team in high school. I still love being a part of a team. That's the most fun and exciting piece of the work that I do. And that actually goes for both my research and my clinical work, because our center is a multidisciplinary team, and I love it. And it's really wonderful to learn from these people who have all different kinds of expertise. And so I think those teams are the best part of it. Yeah.
So we're just about out of time, but is there anything you would like to leave us with, possibly in terms of how to achieve life and work at the same time, or persuade those who maybe don't see it that way?
Yeah. Know you're right. Know that you are correct in that they are both happening at the same time, and to say otherwise is just going against the sort of obvious evidence in front of you. But I think having flexibility with yourself, knowing that you're just going to give more to some things sometimes, and that it makes sense, when you kind of step back and look at it, that you would need to do that. If you're going to become good at anything, you need to spend time focusing on it. And that goes for being a good friend, or being a parent, or being a lab mate, or doing your clinical work. Whatever it is, it takes time and effort, and so there's worth in putting that into all these different places.
Thank you.
Thank you.